Hi, my name is Shavindi. I debated for HFC Bambalapitiya and I used to be the coach of the junior debating pool of Ladies College, Colombo. The motion for today is this house prefers the study of economics as a social and political exercise rather than a mathematical exercise. I will be dividing this video into three segments. So in the first segment, I'm going to give a few overall pointers with regards to the setup of the debate. Secondly, I'm going to go into propositions case, and thirdly, I'm going to go into oppositions case. So firstly, two key points with regards to the setup of the debate. One, keep in mind is that it is a this house prefers a motion, which means why you essentially need to show why the study of economics as a particular x as x or y particular exercise is going to work. You also need to compare it against the other one. So for example, if you were going as proposition, you essentially need to also do a comparison between studying economics as a social and political exercise against studying it as a mathematical exercise. The second key point to keep in mind is what is a social and political exercise, and what does this look like when you apply it to the study of economics. And prop essentially has the burden of setting this up. With regards to moving on to propositions case, what is the study of economics as a social and political exercise? This means understanding and reframing the study of economics as an interpretative and subjective field based on the analysis of data. And I'm going to make two key points in order to reaffirm this. Firstly, economics is a subjective field which requires the interpretation and analysis of data. And the reason that it is a subjective field is that because even within the field of economics, people tend to disagree the solutions and mechanisms which should be undertaken to solve specific problems. An example of this is recession. During recession, economists tend to disagree on what solutions should be utilized by the state or institutions in order to solve this specific crisis, which already shows the incredibly subjective nature of the field of economics as well. Economics depends on analyzing data which is based on the behavioral patterns of people, which are incredibly hard to predict because of various environmental as well as social and political factors which contributes to the decisions and the choices that people make. This oftentimes means that the very choices that people make are shaped and governed by things such as their gender, their race, their ethnicity, their nationality, the generation of wealth that they might have access to, where they live, their access to healthcare, public transportation, even their access to things such as climbing the corporate ladder. All of these factors tend to play a decision and tend to play a role in contributing to the data. But the issue what comes about is how this data is interpreted by economists, or rather economists, or even studied. And the reason that this is incredibly problematic is because economics is not seen as a subjective and interpretative field. It is seen as a field which is based on objectivity, and it is seen as something which is based on truth. And the problem is there is a huge disconnect from the way that it is taught and the way that it actually is. And the outcome of these choices is that unfortunately the very people who they interpret from the data are oftentimes overlooked or even marginalized from the marginalized. And for example, the incredibly skewed racial demographics of the prison system, the gender wage gap. There are certain socio-political factors which contribute to these economic inequalities, which are incredibly overlooked, might be misinterpreted, or might oftentimes even be ignored, because the field of economics itself also is incredibly subjective, because the very people who study it might have certain socio-political factors which affect the way that they perceive the data. But oftentimes, because it is not taught as a social and political exercise, the very subjective nature of the field of economics is overlooked. And the reason that this is incredibly dangerous is because it leads to a field which does not necessarily perhaps understand the consequences or understand how certain outcomes might be affecting the very people who they are studying. For example, the study of economics is not just simply limited to academia. It is also expands into politics as well, especially organized politics, where people who study economics oftentimes maybe make up the panel of advisory boards during a recession, make up people who carry out and research policies, make out people who interpret data, which tends to inform people the current state of affairs. And this in itself means that the moment that is not considered a social and political exercise, people tend to then be blind to the very social and political nature of the study of economics itself, which can lead to outcomes where certain communities are essentially overlooked and are blocked out of access to resources and access to power, and are left without a safety net within times of economic crises. The second thing is that economics is political. The study of economics is oftentimes portrayed as apolitical simply because it is a mathematical exercise. But what people tend to forget is that even when you are interpreting data, that there are socio-political factors which contribute to the way that you interpret data as well. And the lack of acknowledgement and the lack of prioritization in when studying this can lead to incredibly false perception of what the field of economics actually looks like, and which means that oftentimes certain things which should be included within data and should be considered is often ignored and overlooked. So the very political nature of economics is overlooked and portrayed as apolitical, which means vulnerable communities are essentially marginalized and further discriminated against, despite the fact that they are the ones who are most heavily impacted by the field of economics being portrayed as apolitical. And the outcome of this is that the moment that you teach economics, or study economics rather, as a social and political exercise, is that you can target communities and further include and reframe the study of economics as a subjective field. This in turn bridges the gap from what it is portrayed and studied as to what it actually is. Moving then on into opposition's case. When setting up and your arguments for opposition, it's important to note that you are essentially defending a world where economics is studied as a mathematical exercise. This is inherently status quo. And there are two key points which I'm going to use to prove why it is important that we study economics as a mathematical exercise. Firstly, in terms of objectivity, and secondly, in terms of trust. Firstly, in terms of objectivity, because even though there tends to be disagreements among economists with regards to certain aspects of the field, overall there are things which are universally acknowledged to be true and to be objective. And one of these things looks like during a recession, printing more money is bad. And this is seen as an objective truth. And the reason that it is seen as an objective truth is because economics is oftentimes portrayed as a mathematical exercise, which is incredibly pivotal to portraying it as objective. Not just objective, but it is rooted in data, it is rooted in empirical empirical data. And the moment that it is rooted in objectivity, it is rooted in being a mathematical exercise, this means that it leaves very little room for subjectivity and misinterpretation. And this is important, especially in times of crises, because it cannot then be easily weaponized by those who seek to use it for their own gain. And the most prominent example of this is the extreme right wing. There are certain right-wing commentators who seek to make inflammatory comments with regards to certain races and genders. And the moment that you say, okay, that it is a mathematical exercise, it can't be like, it's not subjective, it means that they cannot easily insert their opinion and portray it as like the objective truth, because there are certain factors and certain barriers, certain like requirements that they must meet in order to essentially like prove that yes, that this is an objective truth. There are certain requirements to meet in order to say that yes, this is an objective truth, yes, this is rooted in like empirical based evidence, it requires science, it requires data in order for you to back it up. And the moment that the barriers of entry, or rather the requirements for something to be considered like undeniable fact and truth is lowered, that is it when it becomes far more easier for people to weaponize this for political gain, essentially. And yet, while you can admit that to a certain extent it does happen in status quo, the barrier that it can, or rather the barrier of entry is then further worsened, or is rather further lowered on proposition side, and that is incredibly detrimental, because however much it may happen in status quo, it's going to be far worse on proposition side because of the reason that I stated. And this also means that leads to my second point, which is rather truth, or rather the perception of truth. And the reason that perception also is equally important as the truth is because perception is what reinforces the truth, or rather trust in what you say. And this perception of trust is incredibly important, is because you essentially required in order to reaffirm faith, not just with like government officials, but also with regards to the people, that they can essentially trust what is being like trust that like the advice that they take in terms of when crises are happening, such as like not to panic buy, such as to like make sure that you save up for retirement, such as making sure that you say that you essentially save up or set aside a certain sum of money in terms like a crisis happen, or in terms you get laid off for a job, so that you ensure a safety net. So that the moment that this sort of information comes from certified professionals who are people who are portrayed as objective, who are portrayed as trustworthy, that automatically means that the trust within the field of economics also increases. And the perception of trust is also important because it reaffirms the faith that people have within like the state and institution, and ensures that like mass panic doesn't necessarily upend the economy, or that people lose faith in all officials, that they essentially lose faith in the state and institutions as well. And this is where the weighing mechanism is important, because then you essentially need to show, okay, weighing mechanism is because then you need to weigh up the perception of like trust and the perception of objectivity within the field of within the study of economics rather, against the social and political exercise, and whether or not the portraying as a social and political exercise is beneficial. And weighing those two things up essentially will lead you to like certain benefits and consequences, which would like essentially come about. Thank you.